אני מזמין את הגברת אילנית
Right,
מלכיאור.
Mrs. Ilanit Malkior. Let me be precise. She's the tourism manager at the Jerusalem Development Authority in the municipality of Jerusalem. I'm very happy, but I have to concede that when I received the invitation, I said to myself, I'm not sure that I really belong here. This is, I do not seem to really belong here. And then they asked me to go over the document. Okay, I am responsible for tourism issues, but I believe that one of the several of the points that I'm going to discuss will be somewhat different. We do apologize. We have very terrible acoustics. We're trying to fix this. I can't hear her very well. But I don't think that we are really disciplines that are really estranged from each other. And definitely we should not oppose each other, but we should really cooperate. And I'd like to talk to you about the intrinsic tension in aspects of marketing that I'm responsible for inter alia. When I got the very great privilege some 8 years ago to prepare a plan, a real plan, to develop tourism in the city of Jerusalem, and by the way, I'll open parenthesis, which is drawing from Professor Porter's approach, be it regarding tourism, hotel industry, or any other field. I come from the marketing world, the corporate marketing, and I see a city which, on the face of it, is the most astounding city in the world, which has the most fantastic tourism assets based on a legacy of antiquities, of history. And I started checking what is happening when a tourist comes to this country. What does it do? What is the image that he is receiving from the city? There are many connections that should be further deepened between the ongoing excavations, which of course should be done according to the rules, and I won't even go into this, but and the fact that sometimes we become so enthused with something that we do cause a certain distance to be created. And what do I mean by that? The city of Jerusalem, in its narrative, in its perception, Jerusalem is sometimes perceived as very heavy, all this heaviness of the burden of history. And when I checked those various target audiences, it was the same patterns: Christians, Jews, but the narrative, the archaeological, historic narrative for the city maintained certain patterns which came to Jerusalem. And my idea was to modify that. And what were those advantages that Porter was talking about? We don't have a sea as our small sister Tel Aviv possesses, but this is a city. It's there are many other excavations, archaeological excavations, new things. Now, how do I take that into the tourism world from the point of view of the relative edge of the city, but not from a point of view that would create a certain distance, that would seem sort of elitistic, distant, but rather something that would bring people near to the city and bring in new contents that were not being provided before. For instance, the Zedekiah cave, for instance. A very interesting story. and we are starting to use it, to utilize it in parentheses, in inverted commas, as a tourism attraction. When you start bringing the tourism to such a space, be they from Israel or from abroad, you can see how the relation to that spot changes, and I connect them thereby to contents of those values of history that you're talking about, but to something that is much more accessible. And the city that I started working on when I assumed my position had its genome, sort of, which I had to decipher in order to take it to a different place in the marketing sphere. So my perception was that when a tourist comes here, he comes to the sacred basin, to the holy basin. 2 years ago, I met a tourism agent who looked at the tourism map of Jerusalem, the holy basin. הוא שאל אותי כמה שעות אני צריך... And then I looked at him, והוא אמר לי, זה מאוד קטן. And so you do understand that the way the city is perceived from the outside, it's as if he said to himself, about 1 square kilometer, just a couple of hours will suffice. But how can you explain all the multicultural layers of the city, all the communities that claim to the crown of this space? How do you tell him this very complex and rich story? And this is the narrative that we wanted to decipher and to see how we can render it more accessible. And the idea is that a tourism coming to Jerusalem straight to the Holy Basin, if he is a Christian, straight to the Holy Sepulchre, and if he's Jewish, to the Kotel, to the wall. And tremendous work has been done in developing those sites. And this is done quite good for the city of Jerusalem. A story that each religion can find, where each religion can find its place. And how do we take that and turn it into something much more accessible to all and sundry? Comments not made into a microphone are not heard by the interpreters. But the narrative perception was that we go straight to the Holy Basin, we spend some time, we call this an on-the-bus, off-the-bus tourism. And I can tell you, not as a bred and born Jerusalemite, but as someone who decided to come and live here so that her children would be born here and be raised here. I, even as someone who's become a local, continue discovering new layers to this city. Astounding things which are evolving, fantastic assets, and at the end of the day, you can't really separate and say this is a Jewish asset, this is an Arab asset, this is a Christian asset, and I'll bring the tourist here, there, or elsewhere. They have to see everything. And so today we are delivering a cross-faith, cross-cultures content. Something that is really does provide the human story, the contact, the connection to the local residents. Because at the end of the day, what interests the tourists, think about yourself as a tourist abroad, is that something beyond, not whatever everybody else has already done. Tourists are becoming more and more sophisticated nowadays. And what I'm trying to say is that in this perception, my responsibility, I perceive it as being bringing the tourist. No, let me start the other way around. First, to increase the expenditure of every tourist in the city by rendering the city much more accessible to him. And this goes beyond the sacred or holy basin. And how do we expand really the entire picture, and so that the tourist will not only receive the historic story telling him this belongs to that faith or that culture, on that and that year it was destroyed and rebuilt on another year, etc., but rather based on a perception that delivers the things to him in a different way, as an experience, as an overall experience that he can take home. Where is the impact? An economic impact. People expand the stay. Tourists expand their stay if they spend more than 2.8 hours on nights in Jerusalem on the average. Yes, we've really succeeded in that respect. And the other point is, where does a tourist go when he performs sightseeing in Jerusalem and Karem, the museums, the Holy Basin, of course, the entrance to the city, the center of the city? We are really taking him based on this perception through a whole variety, a whole range of spaces which deliver to him a sort of an odyssey of the city and an overall experience, like an odyssey from one place to another. And of course, in each and every one of these sites, there is archaeology, history, culture, new excavations, and new findings. And we check how we can utilize them and provide a tourist with a much larger envelope which goes beyond the mere historical facts, archaeology, culture, etc., etc. When we spoke about my talk here, I thought that I'm coming from the marketing positioning world, but also with one embracing a tourism development approach. I do not content myself to thinking if I'm bringing less people or more people to Jerusalem, but rather also what kind of product do I deliver to them while connecting all these worlds that are being delivered to them. There is the Armon Naziv promenade. All the buses come there. They let the tourists go down. They go down for 2 minutes. They take some pictures, then they go back to the bus. But when you look at the landscape, you are like within a finger's touch, from the most beautiful place in the world. And by the way, whether they did their excavations correctly or not, that is another issue. But the story was that there is land there for hotels. So they told me you have a land for marketing for 1,300 rooms, or at the end of the day, totaling 2,000. This is really a game changer. In the entrance of the city in the future, when the entire project that the city engineer is promoting will be materialized, there will be another 2,000 rooms, So for Jerusalem, that is rather small in its geography, that is very significant. And I myself have undergone some sort of process here. I understood. And how did I understand that? Because the mayor also always tells us that we have to serve the customers. Let's ask the customers, what do they want? So we brought a group. Among them was one of Israel's leading entrepreneurs, Mr. Tshuva, who had just completed redoing the plaza in New York. And we asked him, what would you require to put up a hotel here? And he said, not interesting. Why? He's clever. He looked at the public sphere, the public space, and he said, just not interesting. Nothing happens here. And then I understood, the penny drop, that my role is not only to look through the tourism prism or glasses, but we talked about a round table, about collaborating with all the sectors, the Ministry of Tourism, all the various government ministries, and we sort of mapped everything. The City of David, they're going to have a visitor center, the JNF, the Peace Forest, etc. And there are many buildings to be conserved. Now, if I don't take all this area and develop it as a tourism area, but with an urban approach that will both serve the residents of the city and people coming from the outside, if we don't do that, we haven't done anything. And so I believe that the meeting point between us, between the worlds of planning, marketing, tourism, history, the the connection between all those worlds must be much closer. Uh, you know about the museums, where is the Israel Museum, the uh, Biblical Museum. Do you know how many tourists? Almost a million, between 150,000 to a million in per year in the Israel Museum. Now, in the Biblical Museum, just on the other side of the street, gets just one third. Then go to the Science Museum, and you will discover an Israeli audience, quite a few religious people, by the way. And I think it's wonderful that they're beginning to consume culture. But then there is the government area of the government offices. There's nowhere to eat. So something that's sort of unconnected to anything. Then I looked at it and I said, in a tourist's eyes, if a tourist comes here, let's say when he comes to the museum district in Holland or in Washington, D.C., or in Vienna, it is quite clear that he will consume this entire space because there are several museums there, but no one will cover each one after the other. There should be somewhere in between, a bench to rest on, a water fountain, something to eat. I went to Holland. We went to the museum district. The Van Gogh Museum was wonderful. So then they went into the water, and then we went into another museum. So if so many tourists come and they consume one museum and do not resort or do not consume the rest of the area, there's something wrong here. There's also the National Library. You know that somebody sets up something but does not look at the space around it. No. There is an alley there filled with thorns, etc., which did not serve anybody, neither tourists nor local residents. And today, after almost 8 years in my position, I would like to say that it wasn't simple in the beginning, in my view at least, to decipher this narrative. How do I sell this? How do I market Jerusalem in the world? Not because we did not have enough contents, values, attractions, legacy, cultural sites, etc., but because the branding or the positioning of all these things, these elements which I mentioned, preserved us just for particular audiences. And my need professionally was to open it to other audiences, to other target groups, to allow it a much larger expression, and going into details and the capacity to utilize such spaces and to envelope them with added values enabled us to open the city to the world. On the international level, we are not there yet, fully there yet, but we can feel already the difference. So study days as this one are very good, and we should introduce into this discipline also aspects and perceptions of marketing, so that we can devote a lot more and attain a lot more, because all this world of archaeology, planning, etc., cannot remain just in professional hands. They have to be accessible, because otherwise people will feel that they're not part of this discourse. And it's like a closed circle. So I've certainly learned my lesson in this respect. So I would like to place this challenge in front of you as well. Thank you.